I am super excited about this topic. This has been in the works for the last, I'd say, what has it been, Matt? 2 months.
I think so, yeah.
Since we've been in Washington, D.C. and contemplating why we haven't addressed some of these bigger, more pervasive issues in our world today, and the role of risk and resilience in really moving some of those challenges forward. And just today, I signed on to LinkedIn and saw a statistic that 50% of CEOs say that it's more important to have chat GPT experience over a college degree. So I use that as an example of something that is fairly new on the scene, um, that is dramatically changing the world in which we work and the world in which we live. And how do we work with our organizations to navigate some of those sea changes more gracefully? But we're going to talk a little bit about what is a wicked problem to begin with and why do we care. We're going to talk a little bit about why wicked problems are different from traditional problems, and where scenario testing playbooks and some of the tool sets that we use in risk and resilience are uniquely adapted to helping organizations thrive and change. And then we're going to put that theory into practice using microsimulations. So we've got a really fun one planned for today. We're excited to sort of get this group engaged and thinking on some strategies to really help our organizations adapt in the context of rapidly advancing technology. We'll go through some case studies, outside of the realm of technology to sort of show the range in which you can apply some of these techniques and strategies. And then we're going to end with some Q&A. So with that, Matt, one thing that really struck me in our conversation a couple months ago in DC is just how eloquent you described what is a wicked problem, and some of the perspectives you have on why we tend to gravitate toward problems that are easier to solve as opposed to those things that may be trickier to tackle.
Yeah, thanks so much. And first and foremost, thanks to everyone spending some of their day with us. We know that your time's precious and obviously excited that you wanted to spend a little bit of time with us today. That said, the other thing I wanted to mention really quickly is that I am definitely a BDO employee. I work for BDO, proud of that fact. But the opinions, thoughts I share today are my own. They don't necessarily represent BDO. So I had to get that out there. We have mid-year performance reviews coming up, and I don't need my boss giving, me another kind of a demotion or issue with that coming up. So just wanted to say that. But to your question, Paul, I think wicked problems, I think one, they abound in today's world, right? They're extremely complex or challenging. They're difficult to solve. They have innumerable causes, and they consistently morph, and there's no real correct answer. Often, research shows us they can be tamed and not solved. And there's a lot of reasons for that. They have, a set of unknown consequences. And I could kind of go on, but, from my perspective, wicked problems, they boil down to a couple different things. One, it's a problem that involves a lot of stakeholders and conflicting priorities. So I start there because I think, as with most things, it's us humans, the human in the loop, right, that increase the complexity around these issues. We're not all one. We have different thoughts, opinions, different perspectives. Its roots are tangled, which means it's really hard to unpack or even define the issue or the problem at times. There's disagreement whether it is a problem, whether it isn't a problem. There's constant change, right? So it changes, the issue and the challenges change with every attempt we have to address it. So we may put a strategy in place, a solution, maybe trying to impact it in some way, shape, or form, and then it's morphing into something different. So it's hard to really put our hands around it. And oftentimes we've never really faced it before. And then, well, finally, there's no way to really evaluate or remedy whether, our solution is going to work. So those are kind of some of the characteristics, I think, around wicked problems. From my perspective, I mean, we we often can't or don't choose not to solve those because it's one, very hard, Two, they're undefinable. Three, it's really just difficult and challenging for us to work through who needs to be involved in it and what it looks like. I think you're putting a poll up right now. I'd be curious to know who you're
Yeah,
kind of.
yeah, as you're talking.
Yeah, go ahead. Go
Background.
ahead. Yeah.
No,
I think-
absolutely. Yeah, and yeah, just interested in this group's perspective on this topic with some of Matt's perspectives there on why we or what sorts of issues are you facing at your organization today that are complex, have no one solution, constantly evolving, just really gnarly to address.
Yeah.
I do want to chime in with a couple of statistics I thought were really very interesting around wicked problems in general. There was a study from Deloitte recently, 47% of executives identify navigating complexity like wicked problems as a top challenge. I'm surprised that's not higher, actually.
Mhm.
The World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, 89% of risks surveyed have significant cross impact with at least two other risks. Some other things, around climate change, I think in terms of um, some of the extreme weather events that we're seeing, we've seen a 50% increase in extreme weather events over the last 2 decades. Obviously, that is a very difficult problem to unpack and determine. Um, and workplace resilience, there was a study, I think last year with PwC that showed that 70% of executives prioritize um, personal resilience training. So helping the organization uh, be, pre- be better prepared to respond to unpredictable challenges. So looking at the screen, no shortage of wicked problems here, Matt. Any that stand out to you?
Yeah, I was going to say, it's interesting. Like some of these things that we see here, especially, weather, and I know you mentioned severe weather events. That's one of the things that I was thinking about a little bit coming into this because, why does this matter for us as risk and resilience professionals? Why do we care about complexity, about wicked problems, about what it is? And first, I think, I don't think anyone's going to argue that we live in an increasingly complex and interconnected world. But that means that the risks are more unpredictable than ever, and we don't have great modeling and statistics and effect on what that looks like. And consider a hurricane, which many would consider, many of us would consider to be a fairly traditional hazard, right? The two hurricanes we saw in the U.S. here in the last, few months, Helene and Milton, both shattered records on what the modeling would have had us say, right? So Helene, 99% of people of homeowners affected by flooding were not in flood zones, did not have flood insurance. That's a modeling problem. That's a whole different world that we're living in. Milton, it shattered kind of the intensification metrics that we've seen in terms of rapid intensification. It intensified 90 miles per hour. Wind speeds increased 90 miles per hour in 24 hours, and it went from a tropical storm to a Category 5 hurricane in just 36 hours. I mentioned that because as much as we think that we have data and models and AI and everything else is helping us these days, we're still catching up on what it really looks like for tomorrow. And there's a lot of uncertainty around that. And so the more that we can understand those things as risk and resilience professionals, the more we can add value to our organizations and the program, and our businesses and our organizations that we work with are more and more being asked to address complex, wicked problems by their stakeholders. And we obviously want to have a role to play in that as risk and resilience professionals.
And I think about even some of the ongoing opportunities and risks that we face around technology adoption and or even just generally the changes that we've seen around the transition out of COVID and back to office, remote work, some of the cultural shifts that we're seeing within demographics. I think there's a big question mark as to how some of those big shifts ultimately impact our business operations, right? And by making these changes, what are the opportunities, but also like what are the underlying risks or the downstream impacts of making any one decision. And risk and resilience is really uniquely equipped to ascertain what some of those ramifications are, really elevate those things to the forefront. Because we all know, when we're leading organizations, oftentimes it is about, what is the new shiny object? What is the new thing that we can do to move our organizations forward? And all of those things can be really very positive. But the reality is, most cases, it's just like the hype cycle, right? Something new comes on board, we're all very excited about it, maybe overly excited about it, speaking as someone that's been in technology, my entire career. And then the reality is that, it becomes more moderated, right? Because you identify, okay, these are the real use cases that we have for this particular opportunity, whether it's technology, whether it's a business process change, whether it's a culture change, et cetera. And over time, it just becomes much more um, integrated into sort of the business as usual. Whereas leveraging tools like scenarios, which we're going to talk about here in a minute, really allow you to have that future perspective, before you go through kind of the bumps in the road on the way to that ultimate outcome.
Absolutely. The other thing that really struck me in this is if you look at it, it's such a combination of business problems, social problems,
Yeah.
risk and resilience problems, and it's kind of all over the map. And there's a lot of connective, a lot of areas that are going to impact one another through that.
Absolutely. So thank you all for weighing in on that. Why scenarios though, Matt? Why are scenarios uniquely impactful as we think about solving wicked problems?
So we'll talk a little bit about some case studies where we've used it, and where I really think scenarios are really important is the ability of making it real, right? Of taking risks, taking hazards, taking situations, and making people feel what it's going to look like. It's helping to understand the problems. It's helping to unpack some of the complexity around different stakeholders, different perspectives, and really just helping to align people on what the problem is that we're facing. And obviously doing so in a safe environment. I think that's the bigger part, right? Is that oftentimes it's hard to have some of these conversations, whether it be attention span, whether it be lack of creativity, whatever it may be, but enabling teams to have better conversations around what could happen, around understanding on the impacts, and around really looking at ways that they can, one, address the issues, address their challenges, but also find the opportunities in them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think one thing that we've seen with our clients is there's such an opportunity here, even to engage stakeholders from outside the organization and really explore it in a multifaceted capacity. Third parties, it might be, folks more from a regulator perspective. It might be folks that have sort of an outside in perspective on some of the products and services that you're bringing to market, and how those things are going to evolve over time as policy shifts, as some of these outside dynamics really change the game for your organization. And so really adopting that future gazing outlook. I think one thing that really has struck me, and we're going to get to this in a minute, around just the underlying process shift that needs to happen with wicked problems in risk and resilience, or in any domain, when you're solving more tactical, kind of more nuts and boltsy kind of problems. You do tend to use more of a test, so you hypothesize, this is the solution, or this is how I think it could advance our performance in a certain area. You put it into practice, right? And then you learn from that, and it's fairly iterative. Like, it's very HBR actually used the example of Groundhog Day, right? Like, we tend to learn by being put in the same situation over and over again, and we consistently, will we'll learn to adapt bit by bit and improve our performance over time. And that works really well for problems that are fairly well known, and where you don't have a lot of ambiguity, there's not a lot of change, there's not multiple ways to solve, etc. Where you sort of have a fixed, like, bar, if you will. But for wicked problems, it's a much more expansive sort of motion, and it's
Mhm.
about how you can tap into creativity, really putting people in the moment, really experiencing it in all the different ways that we would experience that, um, in the event itself. And I know you speak to this in terms of organizing these into sort of ordered versus unordered sorts of events.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, for those who are familiar, um, this is effectively a very high level, and I do reiterate, very high level, version or extraction of Dave Snowden's Cynefin framework, right? So on what you see on the slide, the framework is effectively a way of trying to characterize the situation or the challenge that you're facing to better understand what approaches may work. So as Paula mentioned, on the right hand, on the sorry, yeah, on the right hand side of the slide, you have simple, right? And that's what kind of Paula was referring to of, all right, a checklist, a process, a procedure likely works, right? It's pretty standard. It's pretty the challenge, the problem is a pretty standard one. It's not that difficult. It happens regularly, and we have a process or procedure for it. Cause and effect is really known and understood. There's an obvious relationship there. But as you move to the left on this slide through complicated, chaotic, and complex, there's varying levels of that degree of connectivity between cause and effect, right? And eventually you can't really distinguish it and understand what's happening. And so you need to bring different tools, different approaches, and different skill sets to that. And that's one of the reasons that we often see scenarios being effective with teams that we're working with. Excuse me. Because this isn't necessarily intuitive, and it's not necessarily the way that we do, that we work on a regular basis. And so training that with the teams, allowing them to understand and giving them permission that sometimes they're going to have to act and probe and sense afterwards and then respond, effectively, that failing fast attitude and the ability to know that, like, you're probably not going to get this right. What we're trying to understand is what's going on, and we're trying to really probe and sense, as opposed to solve the problem, is something that's not necessarily the way that we operate on a day-to-day basis. And so scenarios and simulations help us work with teams on that. So we train them on the Cynefin model or something similar to this, explaining kind of what the differences are on the different on this in the framework, and how and what some of the tools and approaches are that you might take. And then we put that into practice with scenarios, simulations, and things of that nature, which allows for learning, growth, and honestly, the ability for us to understand whether we have the capabilities to sense and respond, and those kinds of things as well.
And I think this, as we were talking about a couple months ago, like all the easy problems have been solved. All we're left with are these complex, hairy problems that nobody even, you want to dive into just because you're so busy and overwhelmed with all of the change that's happening around you. Um, I think that the key change, the shift that we're seeing, and you even see it around some of the changes that are being made at the policy level, right? With regulations, with some of the standards, habituating scenario testing. Like, how do you put that into practice so that it's not a once a year thing, it's not a twice a year thing? This is something that you're routinizing in the fabric of your organization, and it doesn't become an exception. It's just part of your habits, right? And so it is more or less, I think the key difference, like as you look at these two models, and going back to the model that we just walked through, is like the sensing aspect, right? And how do you embed some of the contextual aspects of, like, people knowing where to go, people knowing who to connect with in the event that something were to happen, or like how do you solve these things together in such a way that it's much more cross-functional as opposed to siloed. And because our immediate, Albert Einstein, I know, said, we can't solve our problems the same way that, that with the same thinking that created them. I think it was what it was, much more eloquently than what I just said. But the point is that how do we work in a much more integrated capacity to understand what's happening around us, not just within our individual department, but within our organization, within the broader ecosystem, and the broader societal shifts that are happening around us. What does that mean in terms of identifying best fit scenarios that are really going to challenge our organization to solve the problems that are most urgent and most impactful to our organizations, which I know a lot of these regulations have really challenged us to do, right?
Mhm.
Severe but plausible. Define those strategic choices that you need to make. What are the real needle movers? Now you're gonna talk to this in a little bit about where to focus, and then of course off the back of that, like this is again very iterative, right? Because the change continues to happen. Ensure that you have the right controls in place to identify when you need to revisit these things or when you need to stop and maybe run an after action analysis, right? As opposed
Mhm.
to just keeping things fluid. Um, Also build in those external flags to know when you're outside the guardrails of what you're supposed to be, right? And you do need to go back and revisit and maybe tweak your hypothesis.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the biggest challenges, and I don't know that we'll really get into it very much in the next part of the presentation, but I think one of the biggest challenges here is that aspect of sensing, monitoring, probing. How do we do it? What do we do? And I think one of the big takeaways that we've had with a lot of the clients that we're working with lately is conversations around how do you take the data that you have across the organization, because we know that there's a lot more data these days, and everyone is data is king at this point in time. But how do you use the data that you have to make risk data into an asset? And one of the ways that you're doing that is through what we're talking about here, where you're using it to really help frame, create those scenarios, help to drive strategic decision making, and then where you see triggers and things of that nature. So I just wanted to mention that because I think the data aspect here is really important. And that's one of the biggest ways that you can kind of start to develop those capabilities to sense and probe um, effectively and monitor what's going on within your environment.
Absolutely. Yeah, just looking at the chat here. Thank you, Ellie. She says our slides are very easy to understand. But James, the reflecting back on the word cloud and tying it to what we're looking at here, I think like the big takeaway for this is that it doesn't necessarily have to be a big hairy problem. It could be that it's just a very complex problem
Mhm.
and it's difficult to solve. You can use some of these same techniques to solve smaller issues as well. But it's more in the mindset and the application of the tools. But the tools more or less are the same. It's just more around how do you apply it in the context of the methodology. So now I hope you're warmed up, ready to go, because we're gonna dive into a scenario and we're very excited about this. So we're gonna put a scenario into practice. Um, Before we dive into that, we're just gonna do a quick checkpoint just to see where everyone's at in terms of the overall scenario of innovation and risk investment. So the particular scenario that we're going to explore together is actually in the headlines very recently. Um, so we are going to explore a scenario around AI bias in hiring. And so this particular scenario, we are picking around the edges of what happens when you innovate faster than your ability to adapt from a risk management perspective. And where is the balance? And one thing that I really love about this particular challenge is that there's no one right answer, right? For every organization, some organizations might be highly innovative, and that's what you need to do in order to be competitive. And then there might be other organizations that you have an amazing product that you really don't have to adapt all that much. But the world around you is still changing, right? And so, where is that balance? So, just asking all of you as you consider your own organization, and we're not tracking you. This is all anonymous. We can't pin it back to how you respond individually, but um, as you think about that 2 by 2 of what where your organization stands with regard to innovation versus the investment they make in the management of those sorts of risks.
And Paula, I mean, one of the reasons I love this question is because I'm not sure how many organizations or how many of our, fellow risk and resilience practitioners are looking at it through this lens of where is your organization innovating? What is their appetite for innovation? What is their appetite for change? And then how does that impact you as a risk and resilience professional in the organization? And I think just framing it that way is extremely important. And I think the most successful mature programs that we work with are having conversations like that because they are positioning themselves in from a risk and resilience perspective as a backstop to allow their organization to innovate and take risks and do those kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I was at a recent event where I was running a panel, and the head of risk and resilience, he was like, I don't know that any of these questions apply to me, but the thing is, like,
Yeah.
what we are doing organizationally is just it's so imperative that as sort of the context holders of the organization, knowing how organizations are stitched together, right? When you make a change, like a new technology, especially with the complexity that and like set of unknowns that
Mhm.
AI has, right? This is one example. I mean, there are others like quantum, and which we're not nearly down the path as much on quantum and some of these other capabilities as as AI, just because AI has become so democratized. Um, but that to me was such a profound moment because I see risk and resilience so inherent in that discussion. And I think that's partly why some organizations are getting it wrong because they're not necessarily reflecting on the downstream impacts. If I introduce this change into my business process, well, like what is the use case, right? Like what is the benefit that I'm getting out of that? And then secondarily, or maybe not secondarily, but same in the same vein, what are the new risks that I'm introducing to the equation by making this change? And technology teams, cannot do this in a vacuum because they need that fundamental understanding of how the organization is stitched together.
Yep.
And so I love this as an example because one is just it's such a focus for organizations right now, and it's also like such an opportunity for risk and resilience teams to get more embedded with leadership teams, helping the organization make decisions based on the data that's available, right?
Absolutely.
And we don't have a perfect data set, and we're learning more as we go. But having those guardrails to say, hey, we might be going off the cliff here. Um, yeah, this is really interesting. It's actually a really positive reflection of where
Mhm.
things
Yeah,
are.
absolutely.
So, so with that as so I'd say we're somewhere here in between innovative and resilient, secure but static, as a current state, which is fantastic. We're going to dive into a micro simulation that takes us through a scenario. We'll go through the scenario. We'll tie it back to the real event that's playing out actually in the courts right now. And then we're going to talk about, well, how would this have happened at your organization or at this fictitious organization? Um, So hold tight while I run this and let me know if you don't hear the sound.
Today in tech, regulators have taken a significant step by shutting down Tech Solutions, a prominent player in the AI hiring technology sector. This decision comes after a series of investigations revealed serious allegations of bias embedded within their systems, particularly concerning racial and gender discrimination. This shutdown has caused a ripple effect across the business world, impacting companies that have integrated Tech Solutions AI within their recruitment processes. With the technology provider now out of operation, companies face a dual challenge of navigating the legal complexities while scrambling to manage hiring processes that have effectively ground to a halt.
Hey, Simon, this shutdown has left us in a precarious position. Our hiring process is paralyzed, and a lawsuit could further damage our reputation and operational capability. We need a contingency plan immediately.
Agreed. We need to understand the full extent of the impact and ensure we're compliant with any regulatory requirements. AI or no AI, discrimination is illegal.
Exactly. The lawsuit alleges discriminatory hiring practices that could have affected thousands of potential employees. We need to prepare for potential legal proceedings and settlements.
All right, so just to recap, in this particular case, Tech Solutions, which is a third-party provider of recruitment and performance management software, was shut down over AI bias allegations, which has disrupted your recruiting and performance management. They didn't get into the performance management part in this particular inject, but the later inject explores that. This mirrors this current event that's going on with Workday. So in this particular case, we have a gentleman that applied to 100 jobs and was not was essentially passed over for all of those jobs, and he's alleging that it was because he's Black, he's older than 40, and has some mental illness issues that apparently he had reported as a part of. So the allegations are not only against Workday, but they're against the organizations that adopted the technology. So this one I think is just so interesting because there's so many angles to it, in that you could be at the organization that has adopted the software, the third-party software. And, Workday is a very prominent name in the space, and we all use it in some capacity in many cases. And, or you could be at Workday who is creating, producing software that is AI. We're going to do something a little different with this one in terms of the exercise. So we are going to think about talking about how you would respond to this particular crisis. We're going to talk about how this happened. So you could take a couple minutes and think about how this might have happened at your organization. What were the events leading up to this event? Are some of your reflections, Matt, as we give people a little time?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, what we hear often and what I see in this scenario is a lot of folks don't even know what necessarily is within their supply chains, especially when it comes to technology supply chains, right? So it's not very clear all the time. Are you buying AI? And oftentimes, even if you are quote unquote buying AI, what does that actually mean? What's behind that black box? What does it look like? And then, of course, how does that work with your own business process itself, right? In the sense of, are you confident that you have controls in place still that may or may not, that would address challenges like that are illegal, right? Like racial discrimination, regardless of whether you're relying upon a third-party vendor's technology solution. So I think a couple of those right off the top. So I see insufficient testing, poor third-party vending or vetting, excuse me. So
Yeah, no human in the loop. Yeah, a lot about yeah, third-party vetting. It is surprising when you have groups together how many um either they're doing a cursory check, do you use AI or not, or they don't have that check at all. And so I think it is, like you say, just an example of how some of our processes haven't necessarily caught up with the pace of change, in this case, around technology adoption. It is moving quite quickly. I think I don't, I'm thinking about even, my lifetime, I haven't seen anything from a technology perspective that has had this strength of adoption, this level of democratization this quickly, which I think is causing, and I think there's just a lot of ambiguities around even what is the reality of it. Um, so it's definitely one of those multifaceted problems that don't necessarily have a clear solution or outcome. It's more in how you manage it.
Absolutely. And the other thing that I'm seeing, obviously, I see a lot of, insufficient third-party vetting, third-party risk, those kinds of things. But I actually look at this as a monitoring problem too, right? So if you have, I mean, think about it from the Workday example that you pulled up, the real world incident or issue. If we have Workday, do we know what their next, I'll say, update to their technology or their solution is? Do we know if they're incorporating AI into that? Do we know if they don't? We're just using Workday, right? Or at least I'm looking at it from my
Yeah,
perspective also, right?
absolutely.
So
Right.
so I mean, how are we monitoring these vendors that we've already vetted and continue to work with? So
Right. Yeah, and there's likely to be a lot of that going on. And I'm thinking about, just the myriad of technologies where people just swipe their, their corporate credit card and sign up for some third-party service, and they're piping in, company data, and you don't necessarily have visibility into, what data is being used, how it's being used, and then like ultimately what decisions are being made off the back of that data. Yeah, it's insufficient testing, I think, is really interesting because there's the whole perspective of, and I know, Matt, you and BDO do a ton of work in this regard in terms of really like cleaning up your data set, is sort of that whole
yeah,
garbage in, garbage
yeah,
out sort of
yeah.
concept, where like you do need to work with these even third parties, right, on ensuring that the data that you're putting into these models appropriately reflects the world that you want to create, right?
Mhm.
And so that hasn't always been the case at many of these organizations. You have, even if you don't necessarily like, over time, there has been bias in hiring, and, whether it's been systemic or just a factor of how, culture and society has evolved over time, ensuring that your data doesn't reflect some of those decisions and the makeup of the organization current state, but rather looks to the future as to, where you're evolving as an organization. That's a really important checkpoint, that we all need to go through as organizations when we're using these sorts of models. I'm just curious, so it's based on that exercise, has that shifted your perspective at all? I know we talked about the current state, and that may not necessarily reflect how your take on where your organization should be. But given the scenario, would you adjust the balance between innovation and risk investment? I hope you found that exercise interesting, an interesting exploration. That's the first time I ran the pre-mortem concept. Somebody had brought that up as an idea. So thank you for all playing along. That was great. So just general strategies. I mean, Matt and I were talking about this a bit in terms of, well, like what are the key capabilities that we're trying to build in our teams? When we talk about scenario testing, obviously there are aspects of capability that are embedded in the scenario that are specific to the scenario. But um, but Matt, what are some things that, just as general principles that we should be thinking about when we're, building capabilities in this ambiguity?
Yeah, for sure. And as you mentioned before, I think these capabilities are for, wicked complex problems, but they're also for any kind of problems. And I think you should, use some of these things, some of these strategies and approaches, whether it be a big problem or a small problem, because that's how you continue to build that capability muscle, the muscle memory and the approach within your organization. So that said, first and foremost on the left-hand side, make it feel real. And that's why scenarios and simulations work so well. I know I kind of mentioned this before, but it paints so much more of a vivid picture of what the issues can truly mean, the paths they can take, the impacts you could face, and really bring a common understanding of the issues you face. The next, is harnessing the wisdom of the room, right? So you want to make sure that you're structuring preparedness response and recovery efforts with the acknowledgement that the room is always smarter than any one individual. Even those of us who fancy ourselves pretty intelligent, we don't know what we don't know, but someone else likely does, right? So using scenario simulations to prepare or in real response, making sure that you're bringing together a cross-functional team really helps you ensure that you're capturing unique perspectives, that you're understanding the issue and your stakeholders' perspective. And at the end of the day, will help to you create more creative solutions to the issue. When it comes to the third side here, or the third one here, focus on what doesn't change. I think this is trying to flip the script a little bit. Instead of trying to understand what is changing, what don't we understand, where do we see challenges, focus on building the capabilities and approaches that don't change, right? This is kind of a concept that Jeff Bezos and Warren Buffett used in their businesses, and obviously to great success. But what does it mean for us? It's really, from my perspective, it's ensuring that we've focused on the capabilities and the processes that we know we need for any operational disruption or crisis. So a clear North Star or set of guiding principles, the reporting, notification, escalation processes, approach to understanding damage and impact assessments for the organization. How are we making decisions, or who has the authority to make the decisions? Communication, both internally and externally. I think, from my perspective, I'm sure you get the idea, but you want to invest time and resources in getting really good at the things that will be applicable across all incidents or issues, which helps you free up that time and the brain power for those novel and unique aspects that we're going to all face. And then finally, that fourth one, decide not to decide. You need to be intentional in your decision not to make a decision. There's a couple lenses to this that to kind of highlight or explore here. And first, it's to develop simple rules to help you combat decision fatigue or common issues that cause analysis paralysis when dealing with complex issues or wicked problems. So really, it's how do we identify potential bottlenecks, pain points the team's going to face, and come up with some rules around this. There's a lot of examples that we can bring forward, but some of them are any new risk or resilience capability shall be built upon reuse and or align with existing resources and approaches. We're only going to collect data if we're clear on the explicit use. Don't delay in delivering bad news. The room's always smarter than the individual, as I mentioned. So there's a lot of different notions of what these simple rules can be that help your team move forward in a complex environment. And then the other side of this is really acknowledging that not all decisions are created equally during a crisis or an incident. So we need to make sure that we're not just answering correctly, but we're answering the correct questions correctly. So I really think, again, that's a Jeff Bezos concept, but understand what decisions you need to spend time on based on whether they're one or two door decisions. So if you're going to commit your team and organization to one course of action, one single way and approach moving forward, spend time considering what that means, the question a little bit more. But if it's easily reversible or the outcomes of the decision itself won't be incredibly different, then make a call and move on to the next. So those are some ways that we've seen some strategies in dealing with uncertainty and these complex wicked problems in terms of strategies that I would recommend and encourage you to explore.
Yeah, that Jeff Bezos quote of one way versus two-way doors, of that
Yeah.
concept from Amazon is really, I think, particularly relevant in what we just went through AI, because I think there's a lot of unknowns around how it's even going to be applied, let alone like the impact that's going to have, and but I think, I mean, I guess counter to your decide not to decide, sometimes,
Yep.
I mean, it's also important to decide to decide.
Oh,
At times as
absolutely.
well, right? Put something to
Totally.
practice, see what the outcome is. But yeah, make a small bet or make a bet that could be
Yes.
easily reversed as opposed to something that's much more permanent.
For sure. And there's lots of examples of that too, pre-staging resources or things of that nature.
Absolutely. So these are really exciting examples of some wicked problems that you put into play using scenarios.
Yeah, I think we're getting up to the time. So I see Fred hopped back on. Should we go through these or should we answer questions or what's the approach here,
The
Fred?
direction.
I think we've got a few minutes if you want to go through these. We've got 2 questions so far in the Q&A, and then also a great comment from Sue about micro simulations being a real game changer. But yeah, let's go ahead and
Awesome.
go through
Yeah.
these and the questions.
Yeah. So from a case study perspective, there's 2 different case studies that we wanted to share. The first one on the left-hand side is a Fortune 50 manufacturing company. So this is a huge company. They have operations in 70 plus countries, more than 250,000 employees globally. And to give you a little context, this was in 2020, so obviously the pandemic was going on, but also at that same time, there was a huge resurgence of the global Black Lives movement and protest following the death of George Floyd. So the company was informed of the possibility of a class action lawsuit claiming racial discrimination, which had allegedly limited professional advancement of a wide range of minority employees. So basically they knew that they had to do something. They weren't sure what they had to do. They were fearing the impact of a lawsuit, especially in that political environment and social context at that point. So, they asked our team for help to prepare their executives for the lawsuit in case it became public or for how they were going to respond. So they worked with their legal team to really address the legal challenges we're talking about here in the class action lawsuit. But we worked with them to design a focused but kind of immersive simulation to explore a range of potential outcomes with their leadership team. So, I mean, anything from the accusations become public, even though the lawsuit isn't actually formal yet. The organization itself finds evidence of some racial discrimination in their practices. The lawsuit drops on the same day as a planned marketing campaign, and we can go on, but there was a number of these scenarios that we explored with their executives on how they would respond. And so really, as the result of the simulation, exploring these scenarios, the organization's leadership team was able to develop a flexible approach to addressing a number of the likely scenarios. They identified a number of key capability gaps, and one of those was something that was really big for them because they was a lack of robust and defined process in addressing the organization's growing use of influencers. So basically, they had been using a number of influencers. They had that as part of their strategy for marketing and branding, that they were going to use more influencers, but they weren't really vetting them. And in a situation like this, you can imagine what are the challenges related to that and not controlling or understanding what your influencers may say or respond to when it comes to this. But more importantly, probably it also cemented that reputational risk team's value to their leadership and ensured they had a seat at the table for a range of strategic initiatives moving forward. So things like product changes, M&A activities, and a lot more. So a successful look at how you can really use scenarios and simulation to drive value to your leadership team and the organization as a whole through business, the lens of business problems, not simply just kind of I'll say, operational disruption or challenge. And the one on the right-hand side is really another global manufacturing organization. And I'll try and be a little bit quicker on this one, but they're a socially conscious organization. So they had a really aggressive targets around water usage, carbon emissions, environmental impacts as a whole. So they have a factory that although they had reduced their water consumption by about 40% over the past few years, they still faced a number of water-related challenges because the factory extracted and cleaned water for their production from a local river. Normally that's fine, but with the changing climate, they faced, a lot of potential reduced water levels within that river. They were facing some drought, and they had faced a number of operational disruptions over the past 6 months or so, because they were unable to extract water as the levels were too low. So we basically came in and helped their factory team build a playbook for no notice and notice losses of water, and their ability to extract water, developed a planning process based on those specific scenarios, and used simulations to help the team kind of really immerse themselves and gain a better understanding of their current capabilities. So the 2-day workshop really reflected that, allowed the team to create their playbook, but also more importantly, to understand some trends related to the water level. So basically, how can they monitor water levels, and understood that it was a 6 or 7 month time frame. So they had to look 6 or 7 months in advance to understand what the water levels would be in the river. And then also, how could they ensure that they, were bringing water and allowing the local town and the people to use water, even when they were facing drought conditions, to manage some of those brand and reputational issues. So again, it's the look through the lens of resilience, but really business challenges and complicated issues that you can address through simulation and scenarios.
So with that, I think we're opening up I know we've only got a minute or two, opening up for questions. We do have an entire catalog of micro simulations if you're interested in bringing one home to your team. All sorts of examples of wicked problems, and anything from digital risks, looking at third-party and supplier risks, to more operational and sustainability challenges. So I invite you, if you're interested in taking a micro simulation home to your team, go ahead and scan the QR code, and that'll take you to a request form. But with that, Fred, any 1 or 2 last questions before we wrap it up?
Yes, let's do 2 questions very quickly. I was about to ask, where can we find those micro simulations? But then you popped up that QR code,
There
so
we
that's
go.
perfect. And yeah, let's answer these quickly if you can. What's your go-to wicked problem scenario to run with the executive teams?
One of my favorite, I mean, AI bias is a very popular one. We also have been doing a lot in the way of the integration of digital and physical risk. Matt, how would you answer that question?
Yeah, well, one, I would be a consultant and say it depends. It depends on the organization and what our objective is. But two,
Absolutely.
yeah, two, I would say one of the ones that I think has been really interesting and provided some really awesome discussions recently that we've been doing is around labor issues. And we effectively have used a accidental release of salary and compensation information across the organization to drive some of those challenges and what that might look like. And it's really interesting to see leaders kind of think through what that challenge might look like, and whether they'd be on, good footing or not, if that happened.
Okay, and the second question, for teams new to tackling wicked problems, I guess these would be the newer problems that we've been discussing this morning. Where would you recommend starting?
I think it goes back to something that Matt said earlier in terms in reviewing the case studies. I mean, for me, it's the intersection of the horizon scanning with the understanding that you have of how your organization is built. And so like really probing around the edges of what could potentially disrupt your organization, and really pinpoint those issues that maybe macro issues, but they are material to your organization. In the realm of ESG, we talk a lot about materiality. I think the same applies to the realm of risk and resilience, looking at those things that are going to be immediately or maybe not immediately, but in the near term horizon, impactful to your organization, just captures attention. I think novelty is also important. That tends to grab a lot of attention as opposed to running kind of similar same scenarios over and over again. Matt, what are your thoughts?
For me, I think it's the focus on things that aren't going to change. And I know you were talking about things that will change, right? But for me, I'd reverse that and say, look, build the capabilities across the board are going to assist you and support your ability to go after these things, right? And then the second part would be aligning to, what is the corporate, not just culture, but your strategy, right? So where do you think your company, where do you think your organization is going to be playing? What do you think that looks like? And that kind of goes to what you were saying, Paul, about the horizon scanning and understanding, and probing the edges, is looking for those opportunities. Because I think, again, you can show increased value to your leadership, to your organization, and show them that, the risk and resilience capabilities you're building aren't just for when the bad thing happens. It could be for, a number of different scenarios.